Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth. So before you continue, you need to be familiar with Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth. You could have read it, listened to it, watched it, or studied it in class. So we'll follow our usual format. We'll summarise the plot, look at key characters, themes, context, quotes and techniques, and then I'll leave you with a couple of post-video tasks to solidify your learning. So, what happens in Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth? Well, the three witches, who are sometimes referred to as the Weird Sisters, reconvene. That means they meet again after the battle. Now, this is the battle between the Norwegians and the Scottish, that the Scottish were able to win thanks to Macbeth's heroics that we heard about from the captain in Act 1, Scene 2. Now, when the three witches meet, they're talking about the sort of things they've been getting up to since they've last met. One of the witches has been out killing swine, killing pigs. Another witch was upset by a sailor's wife who wouldn't share her chestnuts, so she's decided to place a curse upon the sailor's ship. Now, the audience would respond to these stories with genuine fear, because remember, in the Jacobean era, the audience would have believed in witches, and King James I definitely believed in witches, and he was the ruling monarch at the time, and he even wrote a book called Demonology about witches. Furthermore, King James I, he got married in 1590 in Scandinavia, and when he returned back to England, he had to sail across the sea, and his ship encountered a storm, which King James I blamed on the supernatural. He blamed on witchcrafts, and actually it was later identified that the North Berwick witches, so a group of witches practicing in Scotland, were responsible for this somehow. And after being sort of tortured and trialled, a witch called Agnes Sampson actually admitted to placing a curse upon King James I and summoning a storm to sink his ship. I believe it involved taking a corpse and a cat out to sea and throwing them in the sea in order to summon a storm to kill King James. So these references to what the witches were getting up to would have fascinated and horrified the Jacobean audience, and it would have also reinforced the idea that Shakespeare was trying to curry favour, gain the affection of King James I. Because after all, King James I largely funded and supported Shakespeare's productions. Okay, so Macbeth and Banquo, after the battle, they're heading to a place called Forres, which is where King Duncan is, and on their journey there, they encounter the three witches. And it's only in Act 1, Scene 3 that we actually meet Macbeth, who's the eponymous character. That means the play has been named after him. And the very first thing Macbeth says is, so foul and fair a day I have not seen. Now, if you remember back to Act 1, Scene 1, the witches ended the scene by saying, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. And that foul and fair oxymoron is repeated by Macbeth, and that's the first thing he says. So this clearly shows how Macbeth's life is being influenced and is inextricably linked. That means very closely linked to the supernatural. And when Macbeth and Banquo see these three witches, they can't quite believe their eyes. They comment that they look like women, but yet they don't have all the features of a woman. They have beards, and their skin on their fingers is calloused, and their lips are thin. And this leads into a theme called appearance versus reality, which I'll discuss with you later. And it's basically to get across the idea that the witches are not natural, they're supernatural. They look like women, they're meant to be women, but they don't really look like a traditional Jacobean expectation of a woman. Now, there actually might be an element of comedy in here as well, because if you remember, all the actors in the Jacobean era would have been men. So there would have been three men pretending to be three female witches. So to comment that these aren't female witches, they have beards, that there might be a bit of humour there, because obviously the actors who played the witches may have had a beard. So the three witches greet Macbeth and Banquo, and in doing so give them prophecies. A prophecy is a prediction of the future. So first of all, Macbeth receives three prophecies. The first witch says, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Glamis." Now, we already know that Macbeth is Thane of Glamis. That means he's in charge of a small village or town called Glamis, and we all know this to be true. The second witch then says, "All hail Macbeth, hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." Now, as far as Macbeth is concerned, the Thane of Cawdor is still alive and he's still in charge of his region. So Macbeth initially doesn't believe the witches. He doesn't believe this second prophecy. And the third witch then says, "All hail Macbeth, that shalt be king hereafter." So this witch is predicting that Macbeth will eventually become king of Scotland. And Macbeth thinks that's absolutely ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's never, ever going to happen. So initially, Macbeth rejects the witch's prophecies. It's at this point where Banquo gets intrigued and he says to the witches, "You seem to be able to predict the future. You've spoken to my friend about his prophecies. Can you predict my future? What are my prophecies?" So the witches turn their attention to Banquo, and the first witch says, "Lesser than Macbeth and greater." Now this again is an oxymoron. How can Banquo be less than Macbeth, not as good, and at the same time he's greater than Macbeth, he's better than Macbeth? I think this means that he'll be lesser than Macbeth, because if Macbeth is King of Scotland, that's the highest position you can get. So obviously Banquo is going to occupy a lower social position. However, I reckon Banquo is greater than Macbeth because he keeps his morality and honour all the way to the end. The second witch says that Banquo will be not so happy and yet much happier, which again is an oxymoron. It contradicts itself. How can Banquo be less happy than Macbeth and at the same time happier, more happy than Macbeth? And I think it links to that first prophecy. Banquo might not be happy that Macbeth has become king. He might feel jealous, or maybe he wants to be king. But ultimately, Banquo is happier than Macbeth because he has a clear conscience and he's kept his morality and ethics intact, whereas Macbeth has sacrificed those. And the third witch then says to Banquo, "Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none." Thou meaning you, so you shall have kings. That means your children will be kings, though you will not be a king yourself. And these predictions really intrigue Banquo and Macbeth. So they ask the witches to stay and explain more, but the witches supernaturally vanish. And I've got the word vanish in quote marks because that's actually a stage direction. And if you remember the previous video about Act 1, Scene 2, I explained how in the Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare put on a lot of his productions, there was a trap door in the stage floor, which is probably where the witches appeared from and vanished from. And that sort of symbolises them entering and leaving hell. After the witches vanish, Macbeth and Banquo are confused. They can't tell, were those witches and those predictions real or not? And this goes back to this idea of appearance versus reality. Can you trust your senses? And this also links to another theme, which is madness. They don't know whether what's happened is true or not, and it drives them a little bit crazy. But soon after, Ross and Angus, who are King Duncan's thanes, remember a thane is like a lord or an earl, so they'll be in charge of a bit of land on behalf of King Duncan. They arrive, and Ross declares Macbeth is the Thane of Cawdor. Now, Macbeth initially rejects this idea. He says, "The Thane of Cawdor's alive. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? Why do you claim I'm the Thane of Cawdor when the Thane of Cawdor's alive?" And then Ross and Angus explain that actually the Thane of Cawdor has been put on trial for being a traitor and going against the king, which is treason. And if you remember, the punishment for treason is death, is execution. So actually, the Thane of Cawdor isn't going to be around for much longer. And because you, Macbeth, have helped Scotland win 2 battles against the Norwegians, King Duncan has promoted you to Thane of Cawdor. You will now have more land, more power, more respect. So prior to this moment, Macbeth did not believe the witch's prophecies. But now that prophecy number 1 is true, he's Thane of Glamis, and prophecy number 2 has come true immediately, Macbeth is now Thane of Cawdor, he starts taking the witch's prophecies seriously. He no longer thinks that they're a hallucination. He now believes they're real. He no longer thinks he might be going mad. He now thinks he wants to act upon these witches' prophecies and make them come true. And rather villainously, his first thought is to murder King Duncan. If he kills King Duncan, there's no one in charge of Scotland, and Macbeth can fill that vacuum, fill that void, because as we know, he is a great warrior and a great leader. But at this stage of the play, Macbeth still has his morals and his conscience, and just the thought of murdering King Duncan, who he loves and respects, horrifies him. He says, the idea unfixes my hair. I'll pull at my hair. It gives me agony. He says it makes his seated heart knock at his ribs, so his heart's beating faster. He really finds this idea uncomfortable, and he calls it horrible imaginings. He can't really believe that he's had this idea to murder King Duncan, who has been nothing but kind to him, and in fact has just given him a promotion to Thane of Cawdor. So it's at this point where Banquo quite wisely hesitates to trust a witch's prophecy. Now Banquo has been given a prophecy that his sons will be kings, and I'm sure Banquo would love to see this fulfilled. Who wouldn't want their children to be happy and powerful and successful? But Banquo does not act upon the witch's prophecies. He is hesitant to trust them. Now, I believe Shakespeare does this for a reason. King James I was originally King of Scotland, and then he became King of England. And he claimed the throne by being a descendant of Banquo. So he claimed that his ancestors came from Banquo's royal line, and therefore that was his claim, his entitlement to being king. So I think Shakespeare makes Banquo a wise and sensible character, again to curry favour with King James I, who believes he's related to Banquo. And if Shakespeare can get King James's favour, he'll get more funding and support for future productions and plays. It's also worth noting that Macbeth was also a real historical figure like Banquo. However, the historical Macbeth and the fictional Macbeth that Shakespeare creates for this play lead separate and different lives. Whereas Banquo is presented as wise, Macbeth is presented as reckless. Initially he was wise when he didn't trust the witches, but after that second prophecy about him becoming Thane of Cawdor came true immediately, he now believes the witches and is willing to act upon the prophecy. And this is reckless, dangerous behaviour. He's even willing to kill King Duncan. So which characters do we meet in Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth? Of course we have our 3 witches, the Weird Sisters. Remember, they would have been played by male actors in the Jacobean era. So Macbeth and Banquo's comments about them looking like women, but maybe having beards, could have been a light bit of comedy. Shakespeare mainly wrote 3 types of plays, 3 genres. He wrote historicals, comedies and tragedies. And whilst Macbeth is definitely a tragedy, Shakespeare has included elements of comedy in areas to entertain the audience. Speaking of the audience, they would have also seen the witches as very real and a threat back then. So at the start of the scene, when the witches were talking about how they were killing swine, killing pigs, and cursing sailors and causing storms to drown sailors, they would have been seen as very real threats by the audience. And any time you see the witches in the play Macbeth, you've got to realise they symbolise the supernatural, that which is otherworldly. Of course, we have Macbeth. It's the first time we meet the eponymous character. And prior to this, we've heard that he's a real hero from the captain, and we've heard King Duncan praise him. So we have this image that Macbeth is a really awesome character, a true hero. However, when we meet him, we realise he may not be as good as other people make him out to be. The witches are able to influence him, and they're able to get thoughts of regicide, killing the king, in his mind. They're able to prick his ambition and cause him to do unethical actions. Banquo is, however, presented as wary of the supernatural and therefore a sensible character, a character we're meant to like as an audience. We also encounter Ross and Angus, who are King Duncan's thanes. Their purpose really in the play is to move the plot forwards. We also have mention to the traitorous thane of Cawdor. Remember, he went against his king, he committed treason, and therefore he deserved to die. Remember that because Macbeth is about to fulfill the title of Thane of Cawdor, and I wonder if he will have the same fate as the original Thane of Cawdor. So, key themes, key ideas that we are introduced to or reintroduced to in Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth. We have the theme of appearance versus reality. We see three witches on stage, but are they really witches? Because Macbeth and Banquo seem to think they might look like men. Or are they really real at all? Or are they part of our imagination? This idea of questioning what is real and what is an illusion, an appearance. We're also introduced to the key theme of madness. So after Macbeth and Banquo meet the witches and get their predictions and see the witches vanish into thin air, they are unsure what is real and what isn't, and for a little bit they lose their minds, they're confused. We of course have the supernatural with the witches, and this is made really clear when Macbeth's first words are, "So foul and fair a day as this I have not seen," which echoes the witches in Act 1, Scene 1, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." We also get supernatural in the prophecies the witches give and how they affect Macbeth's future and maybe control his destiny. Remember, that's another key theme, the idea of fate and destiny. And we have the theme of ambition here. Initially, Macbeth is not a particularly ambitious man. He's glad to receive the promotion of Thane of Cawdor, but then his mind suddenly realizes that that third prediction, "you'll be king hereafter," could come true if he's willing to kill King Duncan. And there's a special word for killing a king, and we call it regicide. Regi, the root word, means to rule or to be a ruler, and side is causing death. So regicide literally means causing death to a ruler, killing a king. And this would have been treason, so this would have been something punishable by death. If you killed a king or a queen and you were caught, you would be punished by death. So, contextual knowledge. What historical knowledge do you need to really understand Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth? I want to introduce you to the idea of the great chain of being. This is a notion that in nature there is a hierarchy, there is an order with a most powerful creature at the top and a least powerful creature at the bottom. And if you look on the right of the screen, you will see that order. So God is at the top of the hierarchy, he's the most powerful. Then he has his angels who have power over man. Then there are the kings and queens of the world who God has specifically chosen to rule. Below the kings and queens, we have the common people, the people who were maybe tradesmen or farmers or worked in the market, etc. Below them, we have animals, cows, horses, chickens, sheep, pigs. Below them, we would have plants and grass. And right at the bottom, we'd have objects such as dirt and minerals and rocks. And God has made this order and considers this order natural. And this idea of a great chain of being would have started in ancient Greece with philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato. And in the medieval era in Britain, Christians really built upon this idea. So that in the 11th century Scotland, also called Alba, when the play is set, the idea of the great chain of being would have existed. And also in the Jacobean era in the 17th century, when the play is performed, the audience would also have accepted a great chain of being. And one rule you need to know about the chain is you should not break the chain, because if you do, nature loses its sense of order and becomes chaotic. For example, animals are more powerful than plants, so a cow should be able to eat grass. However, if grass decides to eat a cow, that's not natural. That doesn't make sense. Nature has gone out of order and chaos has taken over. So if a common person like Macbeth, who hasn't been chosen to be a king or queen by God, decides to kill King Duncan, he is usurping power. He's trying to get power above him. He's breaking the great chain of being. And not only is he committing treason, he's killing the king, which is punishable by death. Because God put King Duncan in charge, Macbeth is actually going against God's will. And if you remember, we call that sacrilege, and that will be punished by eternity in hell. So if Macbeth decides to go ahead and kill King Duncan, he'll be breaking the great chain of being. But if you remember, Macbeth was horrified by the idea of murdering King Duncan, and he actually says, "If chance will have me king, why chance may crown me without my stir." And that means he wants the third prophecy to come true. He wants to be King of Scotland, but he doesn't want to have to kill King Duncan in order to get it. Macbeth still has his morality and soul at this stage of the play. So, what key quotes would I memorise if I were you? I would look at the witches' prophecies to Macbeth. They're quite easy to remember in the sense they all start with "All Hail Macbeth," and the first prophecy is "Thane of Glamis," second prophecy is "Thane of Cawdor," and third prophecy is "That shalt be king hereafter." If you're looking for a technique here, the technique would be prophecy itself. You also have Banquo's prophecies that you could memorise and use in an exam. The first witch says "lesser than Macbeth and greater." The second witch says "not so happy, yet much happier." The third witch says "thou shalt get kings, though thou be none." Again, the technique is prophecy. If you want a secondary technique to focus on, I would look at the oxymoronic, the contradictory nature of some of these prophecies. And just as a note, in my opinion, I think the third prediction for Macbeth, "That shalt be king hereafter," and the third prediction for Banquo, "Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none," are the most important. They're the ones that stir Macbeth into action, and it's the one that ultimately seals Banquo's fate. A couple of bonus quotes, in case those 6 were not enough for you. Ross says, "He bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor." He is King Duncan. So King Duncan has told me to call you, Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor. And this is the moment where Macbeth realises the second prediction has come true. He wants to believe the witches, and he wants the third prediction to come true, to be King of Scotland. But at this stage, he's still not okay with the idea of murdering King Duncan. And your technique here would be the title, Thane of Cawdor, and how it links to power. And then the final quote, if you want to memorise it, "If chance will have me king, why chance may have me crowned without my stir." And this is Macbeth saying he wants to be king, but he doesn't want to kill King Duncan to become king. And here, this quote links to 2 themes, the theme of destiny and fate. Will the witches make Macbeth king without his influence, or does Macbeth actually have to take his destiny into his own hands and kill King Duncan in order to fulfill the prophecy? And that links with the second theme of ambition. How ambitious is he going to be? Is he going to be happy with Thane of Cawdor and not do anything, or is he going to be greedy, ambitious for more power? And is he going to commit regicide and sacrifice his life and soul? So, what can you do after watching this video? You can make notes from this video on a physical copy of the play, maybe highlight some of those key quotes. And secondly, you can answer the following question. What effect do the 3 witches' prophecies have in Act 1, Scene 3 of Macbeth? I would look to do a couple of analytical paragraphs. In the first one, I'd have a look at the effect of their prophecies on Macbeth. and I would explore how, by the second prophecy coming true immediately, Macbeth is inspired to commit regicide. You may want to explore the great chain of being here, and the consequences of regicide in terms of treason and sacrilege. In the second analytical paragraph, I'd look at the effect of the prophecies on Banquo and how, even though he wants his kids to be kings, he's not willing to act upon it. He's hesitant to trust the witches. He's sensible. And again, I would maybe bring in some of that contextual knowledge that King James I believes he descended from Banquo, and as a result, Shakespeare wants to present Banquo in a positive light to get favour from King James I. Okay, if you found this video useful for your Macbeth revision, please give it a like. Please subscribe to my Mr. Hardy YouTube channel so you get updates with all my Macbeth videos I'm going to make. And please leave a comment if you think there's any key quotes I've missed out or any key contextual knowledge you would like to share with other students and teachers using this video. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.